Welcome to another of our GST titled Philosophy and Logic. This material is from National Open University of Nigeria. My name is Dan Asukwo, your instructor. Are you writing any of the GSTs soon, or you want to improve your knowledge on philosophy and logic? If so, let us know on the comment section so that we can help you out. If you are a noun student or from any other universities, this will be very useful for you. Please do well to share it with others as well as on your study groups. If this is your first time of coming across our videos, why not do well to subscribe, like, comment, and share for others too to benefit. Unit 5. The Idea of African Philosophy, 1.0. Introduction. The search for African philosophy is dominated by the need for a new identity authentic to Africans, and distinct from those imposed by Western culture and tradition. Before now, the beliefs of the Western philosophers was that two species of human beings exist. On one hand were the Westerners, who are seen and are believed to be the only set of human beings who could reason. And on the other side were the Africans, who lacks ideas and whom rational thought was considered impossible. For instance, some Western scholars like Hegel believe that Africans are people against which all reason could be contrasted. Some believe even if Africans can reason, it is not as developed as what exists in the Western society. Since Africans are special species of human race, Africans cannot philosophize, understand, or demonstrate any form of philosophical enterprise. This unit is therefore an examination of these Western opinions on African philosophy, with a view to show the meaning of African philosophy. 2.0. Intended learning outcomes. By the end of this unit, you will be able to analyze the philosophical existence in every culture. Evaluate the idea of African philosophy in human belief. 3.0. Main content. 3.1. Meaning and nature of African philosophy. First, begin by asking yourself some questions such as, were our forebears non-thinking creatures? Are we still thinking? Do we have a school of thought that equips our policymakers, guides our scholars, and provide guidance for our development? Or are we just living on borrowed thought and precepts? All these questions arouse as a result of the perception of the Westerners about us, and their declaration of our lack of philosophical truth like them. You need to know that the Western civilization is based on the philosophy of the West. This philosophy supposedly emanates from Greece, specifically Athens. Men like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pericles, Cicero, Archimedes, and modern ones like Einstein, Heidegger, Hobbes, etc., have contributed not only to the philosophical thought of the West, but laid the foundation of her science, technology, and art. These thinkers provided valuable answers to issues wide-ranging from morality, government, politics, religion, and war. In universities across Nigeria, students are taught Western philosophy, but what is fundamentally lacking is an understanding of their own philosophy. But do we Africans have philosophy? If we do, what is our philosophy? How do we describe or define African philosophy? African philosophy can be formally defined as a critical thinking by Africans on their experiences of reality. Nigerian-born philosopher K.C. Anyanwu defined African philosophy as that which concerns itself with the way in which African people of the past and present make sense of their destiny and of the world in which they live. If we accept this definition, then African philosophy is a critical reflection on African leaderships in the administration of their duties towards their citizens, the ethical lifestyle. It will also provide possible solutions to the problems experienced in African governance, as we have observed about Western philosophy. According to Joseph I Omoregbe, a philosopher is one who attempts to understand the world's phenomena, the purpose of human existence, the nature of the world, and the place of human beings in that world. Omoregbe believes that this form of natural philosophy is identifiable in Africa even before individual African philosophers can be distinguished in the sources. 3.2. Nature of African philosophy. African refers to sub-Sahara. African, and by simple definition, philosophy is thinking. To think, man requires a language. Thus, the postulation of early Western sojourners that once lived in various parts of the African continent to have restricted to writing as the only means by which thinking is guaranteed. Writing is not a prerequisite for thinking. Aside this position, and as noted in the history of philosophy, certain societies in the ancient time also existed, and the process of thinking was noted especially during the pre-Socratic period of the development of philosophy. As in most Western cultures, thinkers in sub-Sahara Africa constituted a special class of people that sought to preserve their works in various forms, and did so mostly through oral tradition. Morality, religion, and politics were a major concern, but perhaps due to the nature or peculiarity of their environments, while the European philosopher was primarily occupied with issues of politics and morality, his counterpart in Africa was more interested and concentrated in religion and morality. Thus, common to the tradition is the issue morality, which seems to be the core of philosophy. Morality, which can simply be described as the question of what constitutes good or bad, is an essential ingredient of any usable school of thought. Furthermore, philosophy functions on three main attributes in a society. These attributes are culture, civilization, and language. Since Africa have a language, civilization, and culture, the question we should then ask is whether there were reasons behind our culture or not. If the answer is yes, the other questions that needs to be considered are: what did the definite departure point for the thinking African? Is there a uniform body of thought called African philosophy? It is the last question that always generates arguments whenever attempt is made to justify the existence of African philosophy. But then all the arguments end up in revealing the multiplicity of religion, languages, cultures, civilizations, various African society, and as such what eventually become African philosophy in the contemporary time. There is multiplicity of ideas that results from the differences in customs, civilization, and tradition. But this cannot suggest that there is no African philosophy. At the heart of most African philosophy is the concept of communalism, which is not socialism, communism, capitalism, nor the other isms of the West. Most of African philosophies, even though not written, are encoded in wise sayings, proverbs, which in the words of our fathers are the yam with which words are eaten. Take, for instance, the wise words of the people to the east of the Nigeria, that if a child washes his hands, he shall eat with kings. This word epitomizes the fundamental philosophy of the Igbo people to the east of the Niger. Indeed, it shows the republican and egalitarian nature of that society that believes in absolute meritocracy. If the same saying were postulated in the Yoruba land, it will be utter rubbish. In the traditional Yoruba land, royalty, then age, and then merit, wealth and accomplishment, is the order of precedence. There are thousands and thousands of such proverbs that epitomizes the beauty of the traditionalist approach to African thoughts. It should be noted here that the disagreement on whether there is African philosophy or the possibility of its existence also persist among African scholars as well, until now that we have professional African philosophers who now research and teach African philosophy in African universities. One of the most basic disagreements among scholars concerns what exactly the term African qualifies: the content of the philosophy and the distinctive methods employed, or the identities of the philosophers. On the former view, philosophy counts as African if it involves African themes such as perceptions of time, personhood, space, and other subjects, or uses methods that are defined as distinctively African. 2. In the latter view, African philosophy is any philosophy produced by Africans or by people of African descent, and others engaged in critiques or analysis of their works. 3.3. Currents in African philosophy. 3.1. Ethnophilosophy. Ethnophilosophy has been used to record the beliefs found in African cultures. Such an approach treats African philosophy as consisting in a set of shared beliefs, values, categories, and assumptions that are implicit in the language, practices, and beliefs of African cultures. In short, the uniquely African worldview. As such, it is seen as an item of communal property rather than an activity for the individual. One proponent of this form, Placide Tempels, argued in the Bantu philosophy that the metaphysical categories of the Bantu people are reflected in their linguistic categories. According to this view, African philosophy can be best understood as springing from the fundamental assumptions about reality reflected in the languages of Africa. Another example of this sort of approach is the work of E.J. Algoa, a Nigerian who argues for the existence of an African philosophy of history, stemming from traditional proverbs from the Niger Delta in his paper An African Philosophy of History in the Oral Tradition. Algoa, Babalola, 1998, argues that in African philosophy, age is seen as an important factor in gaining wisdom and interpreting the past. In support of this view, he cites proverbs such as, "More days, more wisdom," and "What an old man sees seated, a youth does not see standing." Truth is seen as eternal and unchanging. Truth never rots. But people are subject to error. Even a four-legged horse stumbles and falls. It is dangerous to judge by appearances. A large eye does not mean keen vision, but first-hand observation can be trusted. He who sees does not err. The past is not seen as fundamentally different from the present, but all history is contemporary history. A storyteller does not tell of a different season. The future remains beyond knowledge. Even a bird with a long neck cannot see the future. Nevertheless, it is said, God will outlive eternity. History is seen as vitally important. One ignorant of his origin is non-human, and historians, known as sons of the soil, are highly revered. The son of the soil has the python's keen eyes. In the same, there are several Yoruba proverbs that points to metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and so on. For instance, prostration is not good conduct. One's intention exists in the mind already, which points to appearance and reality. It is not understanding the Ifa message that makes one to look up since the Ifa is not on the ceiling. This proverb emphasizes the distinction between opinion and knowledge. There is the ethical proverb that emphasizes sincerity and the need to keep promise made. He who borrows 1,200 and refuses to pay has blocked 1,400. However, these arguments must be taken with a grain of cultural relativism, as there are so many cultures in Africa, with patriarchies, matriarchies, monotheists, and traditional religionists among the population, and as such, the attitudes of the two society mentioned above cannot be taken to represent the whole of Africa. Leopold Sédar Senghor also embraced this approach. His view in support of his approach is embodied in his concept negritude. In the negritude, he argued that the distinctly African approach to reality is based on emotion rather than logic, works itself out in participation rather than analysis, and manifests itself through the arts rather than the sciences. Other African philosophers who upholds the ethnophilosophy approach are John Mbiti, Cheikh Anta Diop, and Mubabingi Bilolo, etc. It is important to know that this approach has been criticized. The critics of this approach argue that the actual philosophical work in producing a coherent philosophical position is being done by the academic philosopher, and that the sayings of the same culture can be selected from and organized in many ways to produce very different, often contradictory systems of thought. Odimegwu et al., 2009. 3.2. Sage philosophy, philosophical sagacity. Philosophical sagacity, also known as sage philosophy, is a sort of individualist version of ethnophilosophy, in which one records the beliefs of certain special members of a community. It has also been viewed as midway between the claims of ethnophilosophers and the professional school. According to Odera Oruka, sage philosophy is the expressed thoughts of wise men and women in any given community and is a way of thinking and explaining the world that fluctuates between popular wisdom, known communal maxims, aphorisms, and general common-sense truths, and dialectic wisdom, an expounded wisdom and a rational thought of some given individuals within a community. The position of this approach is that although most societies demand some degree of conformity of belief and behavior from their members, a certain few of those members reach a particularly high level of knowledge and understanding of their culture's worldviews. Such people are sages. In some cases, the sage goes beyond mere knowledge and understanding to reflection and questioning. These become the targets of philosophical sagacity. Odimegwu, 2009. This approach wants whatever that will go by the name African philosophy must meet certain criteria, which other philosophies like Western, Chinese, Indian, etc. already have. One of such criteria is not to consider it as a communal enterprise, but rather it should be seen as the work of an individual. This may explain why Odera Oruka contended that philosophy is never a community patrimony, which as such belong to all members of the society. Philosophy, as far as this approach is concerned, is an individual enterprise. It is the conscious effort of an individual philosopher as he contemplates the universe and its reality. Thus we can speak of individual philosophy as we speak of the philosophy of Plato, Aristotle, Hegel's, etc. One of the criticisms of this approach is that not all reflection and questioning is philosophical. Besides, if African philosophy were to be defined purely in terms of philosophic sagacity, then the thoughts of the sages could not be African philosophy, for they did not record them from other sages. Critics argued further that the problem with both ethnophilosophy and philosophical sagacity is that there is surely an important distinction between philosophy and the history of ideas, although other philosophers consider the two topics to be remarkably similar. Okolo, 1990. The argument is that no matter how interesting the beliefs of a people such as the Akan or the Yoruba may be to the philosopher, they remain beliefs, not philosophy. To call them philosophy is to use a secondary sense of that term, such as in, my philosophy is live and let live. 3.3. Professional philosophy. Professional philosophy is usually identified as that produced by African philosophers trained in the Western philosophical tradition, that embraces a universal view of the methods and concerns of philosophy. Those philosophers identified in this category often explicitly reject the assumptions of ethnophilosophy and adopt a universalist worldview of philosophy that requires all philosophy to be accessible and applicable to all peoples and cultures in the world. Professional philosophy insists that ethnophilosophy does not possess the ability to be critical, which is the most important characteristic of philosophy. To them, artifacts of ethnophilosophy, myths, proverbs, folklores, and indeed all the artifacts of ethnophilosophy are not criticized, that even if they entail wisdom, such wisdom is not philosophic in nature. It is emphasized by a member of the group that it is the philosophical texts, that is, writings of these professionally trained philosophers, that can only qualify as African philosophy. African philosophy equals African literature, that is, the whole of philosophical texts produced by Africans. 3.4. Nationalist and ideological philosophy. Nationalist and ideological philosophy might be considered a special case of philosophic sagacity, in which not sages but ideologues are the subjects. Alternatively, it has been considered as a subcategory of professional political philosophy. In either case, the same sort of problem arises with retaining a distinction between ideology and philosophy, and also between sets of ideas and a special way of reasoning. Examples include Nyerere's Ujamaa, Senghor's negritude, Nkrumahism, etc. 3.5. The hermeneutic philosophy. This is a philosophical current which insists that philosophy in Africa should be hermeneutic in nature. Hermeneutics is a theory and method of interpretation, especially the interpretation of philosophical texts. This current was suggested by a Nigerian philosopher, Theophilus Okere, 1983. After which other philosophers like Sene Saraqueberhan took the challenge. Makumba, 2007. This philosopher does not want to be engaged in the debate like what ensued between the ethno-philosophers and the professional philosophers. To this current, myths, folklores, proverbs, etc. are no philosophy. Philosophy is and will remain a conscious effort of a critical individual. However, the non-philosophy could form the philosophy of any race. It is from non-philosophy that philosophy arise. Ogagioffor, 2001. The emergence of philosophy from non-philosophy is made possible through the process of hermeneutics, which is interpretation. Thus, philosophy arises from non-philosophy when philosophers reflect on symbols of culture like myth, folklore, and proverbs of the people, and interpret them critically. It is therefore correct to say that the culture of Africa is of some relevance in the emergence of African philosophy. 3.6. Literary/artistic philosophy. Literary and artistic philosophers recognize that there are some African literary scholars whose writings reflects philosophical issues in their essays. These scholars are seen to be critical of the African condition in their works, and they try to point out what existence entails in an ideal African situation. Scholars like Achebe, Soyinka, Okotpebtek, and others are therefore recognized as being philosophical. 3.4. The historical trend. This idea was initiated by Ogwegio IV, 2000. He contends that the idea of philosophy has been in existence in Africa even before the development of the Greek philosophy. The argument then is that it is the African philosophy, through the Egyptian connection, that influenced the emergence of philosophy in Greece. The implication of this argument, therefore, is that there would not have been what is called geek philosophy today if African philosophy did not exist. Greek philosophy to them is nothing but child of Egyptian philosophy, which is African. Moreover, we can identify the influence of the Egyptian philosophy on Greek philosophy in two ways. First is from the point of the military invasion of Egypt by the Greeks, during which the Egyptians were conquered. At this time, all the works of the Egyptian philosophers were appropriated to themselves. The second has to do with the view that the people who we today refer to as Greek philosophers only repeated what they learned at the feet of the great Egyptian philosophers who taught them. More so that Greek philosophers like Pythagoras, Aristotle, and some others were trained in Egypt. 4.0. Conclusion. The contention of whether there is African philosophy or not has been laid to rest, given the various African philosophers' views that have expounded in this unit. Although some positions may be contestable, however, given the level of the growth of African philosophy and its waves. In the contemporary time, the philosophy is assuming the same status with the Western philosophy. 5.0. Summary. To get the best of this unit, you may need to repay it again. Also drop a comment on the comment section stating the important lesson learned.